what do you do when your partner yells at your kid and you don't agree with that? Stepping in all the time is exhausting. If you set some clear limits, you can be less exhausted and know how to handle any difference in co-parenting. You're listening to the Bear in Mind podcast, episode 153.
A podcast that breaks it down so you can break the cycle for good. Now, your host, Tara Rama, but you can call her T.
I'm going to start out with an odd quote, and I'll read it back to you at the end of this, and it'll make a lot more sense. And it's from the book, Adult Children, The Secrets of Dysfunctional Families by John Friel and Linda Friel. And it's in a paragraph, and I'm just going to take out 2 sentences. What would someone with a full cup do when faced with an abusive or manipulative relationship? They'd simply leave. That's kind of an odd quote. And it'll make a lot more sense at the end. And it's a bit of an extreme quote, but it has a lot to do with how we look at our relationships. And then in particular, when we have shared responsibilities with someone and we're co-parenting with somebody. And a lot of questions come up with my clients and sometimes with some of my parent friends is that my parent or my spouse or my partner, they do this, they do something different. And I'm going to use the example of yelling because this is a podcast about how to stop yelling. And let's say your partner is yelling. That's one of the behaviors you don't want. You can insert another behavior. They also have a difference in value system. They think yelling is necessary. And I want to point out something from the previous episode. So some people believe yelling is necessary. And sometimes some people believe yelling is bad. And notice that both of them are not the truth. And I mean, not a universal truth. So you get to choose how you look at yelling, just like that person who thinks yelling is an effective parenting strategy to raise well-rounded or successful children, whatever that is, whatever the end of that is. So what do you do when there's those kind of different beliefs? Yelling is bad, yelling is necessary. You do nothing. Now, I realize that is not the answer that probably most people want to hear, and it was an answer I didn't want to hear. But I'm giving you the short answer right away. You do nothing. But that does not mean you do nothing all the time. So when it comes to relationships, part of breaking the cycle is seeing another person's relationship with somebody else as separate from you. So your child has a separate relationship with you as a parent, if you're the mother or the father, and then they have a separate relationship from you with their mother or father. They have a separate relationship with their grandmother, separate relationship with their grandfather, separate relationship with the stepmother. Seeing that separation as each person having that kind of their separate own relationships is so crucial to breaking the cycle, because we don't realize that subconsciously we think like it's all connected in some family, but we can't see the separation. So my daughter's relationship with her father is very different. And notice that I say that it doesn't matter if you are together and you're living in the same household with the person you co-parent or if they're living in separate households. So if we're talking divorce, it doesn't matter. It's still the same. It's still this separate relationship. And a lot of times people step in when the values are different from yours. So yelling. You don't agree with yelling, and you step in every time somebody is yelling. And what you're doing is you're creating kind of this triangular effect where there is no relationship in dealing with the relationship between the child and the adult by itself. Now it's child with 2 adults, and there becomes this sort of triangular way of handling the relationship. But that doesn't mean that you don't deal with your differences and you don't address things that you don't agree with. And here's where boundaries and clear limits come in. This is nothing new, but I'm going to try to say it in a different way. Because when we talk about boundaries and clear limits, we talk about it kind of in a vague way. Oh, we need to set boundaries. We need to set limits. And here it is really important to look at the detail of what your limit is when you see your child's relationship with an adult person, another adult person. So grandparent, the co-parent, an older person, whatever that relationship is. You first see it as separate, and then you first know what your boundary is with that person. It's no different as if you wanted to set boundaries with a friend, setting boundaries with your parents as you are an adult setting boundaries. Except in this situation, you have a child involved, and you want to set boundaries that are in alignment with your values. Now, this is going to be different for everybody. This is why I'm not going to tell you. I'll share with you my own limits that I set to inspire you to think of your own limits when it comes to co-parenting with somebody that has different values. So my husband has been yelling a lot lately. And I have been doing some reflecting on where are my limits. And I hadn't really been clear, and I felt like I was stepping in too much when the yelling was escalated. So I decided that, because then what ends up happening is that the relationship between me and my husband become another argument about our differences and how we approach parenting. So now everybody is just in this one big argument, which is not even helping your kid, by the way, then. So I realized that the limits that I'm going to set is not around yelling. So he can yell and then they can have their own interaction. The yelling is my limit is two things. One, if it ever escalates to any sort of physical kind of where the child could get hurt or held or anything like that. When it has nothing to do with somebody's safety, their physical safety, like they're actually hurting somebody. So that is my limit. And I think that's most people's limits. And then the other limit around the yelling is I'm going to be like, okay, he's going to yell. He's going to say his stuff. When the yelling involves character, when I'm losing my words today, when he says you're being a spoiled brat. So you are fill in the blank, you are being selfish. Those are two things he actually said. And I said, that is when I'm going to step in. So I have my limits drawn around these two things. So physical and then the character part of it. And then what do? I don't address it with my husband. I would address it with him later, and I did address it with him later. But in that moment, when things are kind of escalating, I walk away. I take my child and I walk away, go to another room. Now, the structure of this is really knowing where your limits are with the other person. And even if, let's say, you're dealing with grandparents and you feel that they are giving them too many treats or food that you don't want them to give, you get to decide those limits. You can decide, okay, sweets are fine, they're at the grandparents'. But let's say you don't want them to have something they're intolerant to. A lot of children that just happen to know they have lactose intolerance. And the grandparents just give them whatever has dairy in it. And that is a limit for some people. It's not that, okay, they can have the lactose. Some people are like, no. And then they remove the child away and say, you can interact with them. I need to be here 100% of the time and ensure that they don't consume dairy, or we do video calls. That is an option, but just being really intentional about it helps you clarify and approach disagreements that you have with other adults, that you have with your parents, that you have with the person that you're raising your child with. You are more intentional, and you can decide what you want to do. You can let it go. You can walk away, remove the child. And when you know that, you'll be less exhausted. Because right now it's like things are happening and you jump in and you jump in and jump in, or you're trying to control this situation ahead of time by making sure that your kid eats enough food so they're not eating at the grandparents, so you're trying to control your kid, or you're trying to control your grandparents, and you're exhausted. And there's a lot of anxiety around that. So what's the end game for here? And I'm going to wrap it up because this is really important. It is actually something that you're teaching your child to do. You're teaching your child. You don't have to tell them that they need to set boundaries, but you are teaching them how to set boundaries when they get into when they're older. So when they become more peer focused, and then when they're adults, you're teaching them how to set boundaries. And you're teaching them, what do you want them to do when they're in a relationship that they don't want to be in, where they're being hurt, either emotionally or physically. And your answer to that question may be very different. You may want your child to be in a relationship and fight for themselves and stand up for themselves and all of that. When you are clear about your boundaries and what you want to do and how you're going to approach that boundary, it might be when you have that boundary, you decide, I'm going to have a discussion right here and then with that other person about this thing. That might be, but as long as it's intentional and you're conscious of it, know that that is the end game. You are teaching your child how to handle relationships. And so that is what I'm going to bring it back to, that quote, is what would someone with a full cup do when faced with an abusive or manipulative relationship? And the answer to my question is going to be different. You might want your child to learn how to fight. My answer is, I want them to leave. Get up and walk away. That doesn't mean leave forever. That means temporarily get out of the situation so that they can think and make a decision with their rational brain. That's all I have for you this week. I'll check back with you next.
Thanks for listening. Listen for a new episode next Tuesday by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform. Bye for now.